Good morning, everyone. So, first of all, for obvious reasons, that's the only slide I have for you today. I've learned this a long time ago from a very good friend of mine from Belgium, and he said, Jan, either you have slides or you have something to say. And I decide that saying something is more important than slides. So there should be one single slide that shows our logo, and that's it. Now, who here doesn't know who RedHat is? Thank God. Really? There are some. So let me put a few things straight, because there are a few topics I'm not allowed to talk about, and this is for obvious reasons. As you all have heard, we are right now in the acquisition phase. We are being bought by IBM for $34 billion US, the biggest pure software deal in the history of mankind. Makes me quite proud. And that means that I'm not allowed to talk about any financial details and etc. On the other hand, I am allowed to talk about what we did in the last quarter, because we just published our numbers, and this is very simple. We just grow like hell. And so that's a good thing. RedHat as a company is now around about 13,000 people worldwide. We are doing close to $3.5 billion in revenue by selling free software. And if you think that's a cool thing or not, it doesn't really matter anymore, because my real topic is the fight is over. You know, it's done. We do not have to fight for open source anymore. Open source is now the default development model, not the default business model. That's a different story. But ultimately, we are sitting here at CloudFest, and before that we had other conferences and festivals named after hype technologies and etc. I guess I will be doing a keynote soon on a serverless conference or a zero coding conference or whatever you want to think about. It doesn't really matter anymore, because two things have happened in the past 10 years. Two big revolutions that nobody really noticed or cared about too much. Revolution number one is what we all know, and it's the reason we have cloud. Let's be totally open about this. Hardware is irrelevant. I'm sorry for the hardware manufacturers in the room, but there are some niche markets for specific hardware. I totally agree with that. But ultimately, when you look at how we build IT stacks nowadays, you see that almost everything has moved into software layers. Even companies like Cisco nowadays say they're pure software companies and hardware is not their main business anymore. Now, you can believe that or not. That's not my business to make that decision. But what we see is in networking, virtual networking, and etc., everything moves into the software layer. And when it moves to the software layer, it becomes very obvious that when we talk about the lower levels in the stack, that there's only one solution to that, and that is standardization to every level, commoditization on the lowest levels everywhere. And this is where, of course, open source kicks in. This is what we see. The lowest levels of all modern IT stacks are more or less completely open source. There's one company that still builds its own stuff, Microsoft, of course, but they also have to use open source technology at the very bottom. I guess you all know this, but in Azure, in the Microsoft Cloud Systems, the virtual networking that they use, the virtual networking layer, is their own little Linux distribution. And why did they use Linux for that? Very simple. Not because Linux is the best ever and they couldn't build their own network stack, though I sometimes want to believe that. No, the real thing is the cost of interoperability. When you maintain your own lowest level stack, you have to care about a lot of interoperability testing and making sure that everything works. Now, when the rest of the world has already decided to work with one stack, you would be really, stupid to ignore that completely. So we see on this lowest level how open source has creeped in everywhere. Doesn't necessarily mean that all of these are open source products, that these are stuff you can download everywhere and build it yourself. And to be completely honest, you shouldn't even try. This is one of the things that I have seen that's coming out of this revolution of software-defined everything. I talk to a lot of startup companies and smaller companies that say, we're not going to pay RedHat a lot of money because you're so expensive. It's open source and you still want to have money from us. There's something wrong with you people. Well, yeah, it's called capitalism. I'm really sorry about that. But we also need to pay our people. But they say, let's build the whole stack ourselves. And my argument to them is always, that's not your business. Your core business is something else. When you're a startup business in whatever cloud monitoring or stuff like that, then that is your core business. It's not building a 100% stack. In this 100% stack that you see in almost every organization, that's where the change really happens. We talk about DevOps and cloud computing and deployment models and Kubernetes and OpenStack and whatever you want, just like they're normal words. Now go back in time 5 to 6 years, and you couldn't even have that responsibility to build your own stack because you had to get into a vendor, and the vendor dictated you what you put up in your data centers or in the clouds or etc. So now you can take this responsibility back, which is what a lot of CIOs and CTOs are doing. They say, you know, we need to own the stack because that gives us ultimate authority over everything and it helps us build stuff. But there is a price to pay for that. When you look at IT stacks nowadays, when you look at software-defined stacks, highly modular, deployment model independent, no matter if it runs in the cloud, in your data center, in whatever hybrid setup, what you see is that from this functionality in any stack, there's maybe 20% of functionality in an IT stack that is your secret sauce. That is the stuff that sets you apart in the market where you actually make money, what defines your margin. But 80% of the functionality in any IT stack, I dare say, is completely non-competitive stuff. And when you think about that for a second, you start to see why the world is changing so fast. I always have this example of developer conferences. You know, how many people here have gone to developer conferences over the last 10 years? A few. So let me explain it for those who don't go to developer conferences. First of all, the most important thing at every developer conference is the t-shirt, nothing else. So I have 255 t-shirts. I stopped after 255 for obvious reasons, because 265 t-shirts would be wrong. That would be a little bit too much braggadocio. But the t-shirt is number one, and number two is when we go back in time 7, 8, 9 years. A developer conference was typically a Java conference because they were the only people who had enough money to set up developer conferences. So we go to Java 1. And Java 1 was then typically in whatever Vegas place or etc. And you had these round tables, these big round tables where all the attendants were sitting. And what you saw was company tables. There was a table for company A, a table for company B. People were sitting there together, and they wouldn't talk to other tables because they feared they would spill some corporate secrets when they share what they're working on and etc. So it was a very isolationist movement. Nowadays, we have a lot of smaller conferences. Meetups are the new conference format. You know, everybody goes to meetups everywhere. It's more grassroots, it's more decentralized. And in these meetups, what you see there is a completely different world. You see developers openly sharing how they build these lower level stuffs in their stacks. And they participate with each other, competing companies. Developers from competing companies are sitting together and say, hey, how are you using Kubernetes? How are you using whatever Gluster storage layer or stuff like that? And they totally openly talk about it. Why? Because everybody knows it's in that 80%. It doesn't make any difference from a corporate, from a competitive perspective. So this 80% can be freely shared. Now that's my job at Red Hat as Evangelist, the most weirdest job title ever. And let me explain to you in 1 minute why I'm Evangelist. Because I'm the worst pre-sales that Red Hat has ever hired. I was hired as a pre-sales in 2005 when Red Hat was a 700 people company. And I was on the road in Germany and Switzerland and etc. for 2 years. And then the vice president and general manager came to me and said, Jan, you completely suck as a pre-sales. You're the worst pre-sales we ever hired. You only talk bullshit, you never file your expenses on time, and your documentation is nothing to write home about. But the bullshit you talk makes people understand what Red Hat is about, so we make you Evangelist. That's how I got my job. It's a proven career path. Just do it, talk bullshit all the time. You see it in, no, that's not good. So back to the topic. These developers nowadays, they have more or less taken over. So nowadays we talk about Agile and Scrum, and before that it was XP and etc. The real topic behind that is exactly the same as the one I'm trying to paint with the 80% picture. Everything goes down to communication. Nowadays it's really about sharing knowledge in every possible way so that people can work together in better ways. And they saw this very early on, that it doesn't make sense to have all of these incompatible stacks everywhere. You remember when the world started to run after OpenStack, and OpenStack was the best since sliced bread and etc. And then a lot of people found out OpenStack is maybe a little bit complex and not really geared towards smaller organizations, because you need at least 5 machines just to get OpenStack up and running, and then you still have nothing to run workloads on. So people were looking for alternatives, and in comes a company like Google And Google says, hey, we saw this container thingy, and let's do this with containers, and let's build whatever orchestration around it. They call it Project Borg. And then they decided to make it open source, but Google is not, anyone from Google in the room? Well, yeah, the camera, sure, thank you. Google has not necessarily a stellar reputation in creating and fostering open source communities. Let's leave it at that. So they came to us. And they asked us, can you help us make this stuff open source? And we said, of course, but you cannot call it Project Borg. You have to rename it. So that's why it's called Kubernetes nowadays. But Kubernetes is specifically geared towards the developer expectations and not necessarily market expectations. And this is a very important point. From a power perspective, from a design perspective, from an architecture perspective, we are now so decentralized with the decision-making process that a lot of developers make these decisions on their own. Now, we all know the disadvantages of that. I've been at a lot of companies where they say, we started building this stuff, and the guy who built all this stuff, he was a true genius, and he knew, he was unbelievable, and nobody really understands what he's doing, but he left half a year ago, and now we cannot use his stack anymore. And I'm like, yeah, damn, that's bad. That's why you come to us, because we take care of that 80%. That's our job. You focus on that 20% on top. That's your business. That's how you make money. But that 80% needs the sharing across verticals, across companies, and that needs a catalyst to do it. And you can do that as a small company in your local meetups, no problem, but you cannot scale that to a level to get the features that you want into global upstream projects. That's where you need a power distribution that works, and that's our offer that we have made for a long time. A lot of people said Red Hat as an open source company will always fail. When I joined Red Hat, they told me that, open source is no business. You cannot make money with open source. And now I'm sitting there, looking at the IBM takeover, $34 billion, and I'm like, yeah, that didn't age well, that statement that open source will not work. But why is IBM buying Red Hat? I do not think, now again, this is my personal opinion because I'm not allowed to talk in the name of the company over this. But let me tell you one thing, when IBM as a company invests a third of their market cap, $34 billion, to buy Red Hat, then it's definitely not because they want us to become like they are. It's because they see and they hear from their customers that this revolution, this change of revolution, this open source development approach in the lower levels of the stack is now everywhere, and everybody needs to adapt to it. Microsoft is an interesting example for this, because in Microsoft you can see how they moved this big tanker around within 4 years. After Satya Nadella took over, he started listening to his people, and what he saw was quite shocking. There was no net new business in .NET environments or somebody deploying the complete Microsoft stack. It was over. Everybody was switching to web-based stuff, which typically means an open source stack. Now, instead of saying we need to fight them, Microsoft made the decision to embrace this. And they did a lot of things in the past 4 years. When you think about this, everybody who is longer in this business, when you think about how the world looked 4 or 5 years ago and how it looks now, it's radical. It's such a big change, and open source is part of that, and Red Hat is also part of that, but not the defining factor. The defining factor is the second revolution that has happened, and that is the mindset change in people. It's the way how we look at IT nowadays. We couldn't do it without the first step. We needed to have this software-defined everything stuff. You cannot do DevOps in a hardware-oriented business. It's really simple like that. And you cannot do it in monolithic software architectures. So everybody who is working on Oracle stacks knows this. DevOps and Oracle databases don't really go together. Yes, there are some people who put Oracle databases in a Docker container. Now, have fun with that. It's, I would love to see that in action. I've seen it in action. I've seen it fail a few times. So these old big stacks are going away on the hardware and the software level. It's being replaced by a very modular approach on every level. And this can only work with the open source mindset. You cannot replicate stuff that doesn't use open source. And that's, some people still think they can make a business out of that. They can do open core business, and some parts are open source and some are not. We at Red Hat have never believed in that. We have always said it must be completely open source. And my job as a salesperson is to convince our customers that we have added value on top of the software itself. If I cannot show that added value, use the free stuff, use the open source upstream projects, and be happy with it. But it is a complicated business. Just imagine how we went from 3 different departments. We had the network departments, we had the hardware people, we had the operations people, and then we had the developers, and then we had the separate development environments and all that kind of stuff. Moving all of that into a software-defined world means a lot of responsibilities are changing inside the organizational stack. So what we now see, and that's the part that I care most about, is how do people adapt to this? That's the second revolution. How do we move away from a hierarchical structure in a company where there is a CTO that says, this is our strategy for the next 5 years, implement it somehow, and then every year the only thing you get from your CTO is, by the way, we are cutting your budget by 20% because we have to save money. Deal with it. That's not strategic thinking. So now we see people that understand this 80-20% thing, and they start to actively reach out to their competitors. Just a few weeks ago, there was this wonderful example of German car manufacturers where Daimler and BMW are now working together on the platform for autonomous vehicles. Why do they do that? Not because they want to, be like a perfect example of kumbaya, my lord, shiny, happy people. No, not at all. They do this for cost saving, but because they also see that autonomous vehicles ultimately do not make a difference between what brand is at the front of that car. It's about how do we get cars safe on the street so that not too many people get killed, and that we know in a predictable way what's going to happen. Platform business, 80% business. Avoiding collisions is not a competitive advantage, or at least it shouldn't be. I'm quite sure some people will think different about that. But I do not want to have a road full of autonomous vehicles where you have to have a risk calculation because you couldn't buy a big expensive car and you know that the cheap cars do not avoid collisions in the best possible way. No, this is not going to happen. So there we also need this cooperation. And that's what we at Red Hat have been doing for the past 25 years. We've built this whole thing. So now everybody is coming and saying, we're going to do this. You see companies like Pivotal coming up, and you see a company here coming up and there coming up. Here's the one thing that binds all of the new things together since around about 7 years. And you can tease me on this. Name me one big thing in IT that is not built on open source technologies. Think about it for a second. We have Kubernetes nowadays. We have OpenStack nowadays. We have storage layers nowadays, virtual network layers nowadays. Everything runs on open source. Even almost all of the cloud infrastructure is based on open source. I'm not saying it all is open source. Google and Amazon and etc. would definitely oppose that notion. But I can clearly say, without the open source technologies that also we at Red Hat created, none of these things would exist nowadays. And that's my core message I want to give to you and to take back home. Open source is here to stay. The decision is made by developers and by a lot of other people. Open source is the prevalent development model for anything software, and it will soon go also into hardware. I'm looking forward to a time where I can finally have really open hardware for everything, but that's because I'm a tinker and I like to solder stuff myself. And if you ever visit my home, I've automated it myself. It's all open source, open hardware, and it doesn't need any internet connection. It fails all the time, so it's good that I'm living alone there, because sometimes I come at home and I want to turn on the light and then the Roomba starts cleaning because it's everything. It's a complicated world, and in this complicated world we all need some guidance. Now, what is the best guidance we can get? The best guidance is the guidance that we can freely share and redistribute and form communities around them and build stuff in better ways. And that's the promise that we gave you 25 years ago. That's the promise we will give you for the next 25 years, at least at Red Hat. And I hope you will all join us at our booth to talk, if you want to, about the more technical intricacies. And welcome to the world of open source. Welcome to a revolution that has changed everything without anyone noticing. This is exactly the world I want to live in. Thank you for listening.